we will discuss Banu Bargu's last book, Disembodiment, Corporeal Politics of Radical Refusal. And the book has been published by Oxford University Press last year. And I can see that I saw every single phase of this book, and I can consider myself as a kind of a co-author, not because of any contribution, but because I was cooking dinner while Mario was writing. So happy to have this conversation, and let me also introduce Anna and Key. They are both our PhD candidate in the History of Consciousness department. Key is working on space in the intersection of, let's say, the Frankfurt School critical theory tradition and the phenomenology tradition. And he's co-editing a special issue in environmental and planning, politics, and space. And Anna, also, as I said, a PhD student in the History of Consciousness department. And I want to mention a couple of articles she published in the Pozlen media. How do you call it? Correct? Pozlen. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. And the two articles are titled, Did Lenin Create Ukraine? On the Right of Nations to Self-Determination and Marxism. And the other one that I really want to read is Adorno in the Kremlin. I think the day is organized in this way. Banu will introduce the book for 5-10 minutes.
More than 20.
Oh, then, okay, you changed the plan.
Yeah. We changed our plan.
You changed your plan. So then we have Ian and as a discussant, and then back to Banu, and we will open the conversation to the entire room. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Max. Yeah, it's a strange thing to be discussing a finished book, because there's something always like a remembrance or a eulogy or a celebration, however you look at it, about it, rather than an active intervention that is open and ongoing. And so, I mean, I guess like for the author, the book is already sort of dead before it's living a life of its own. So this is why it's really such a pleasure for me to be in conversation with Anna and Key, and not knowing really what they're going to say. So I have to. So it is a kind of new and exciting encounter for me in that sense. And also thanks to Chair Tomba for insisting that I organize this event, which I was trying to avoid doing. And also, of course, for suffering through the decade of this book's writing. And yet it did take me about a decade to write this book. And actually, just like the first one. And that makes me think, I wonder how many more books are in me if that's the pace at which I'm going. Anyway, let me begin by commenting maybe a little bit about my trajectory, for those of you who may be familiar with the first book that I wrote, and to maybe mark some of the continuities and the differences between the two. So the most, I think, enduring continuity between the two books has been my ongoing interest in violence in the body and in agency. So those thematics have not changed, although I think there is a very stark difference, I would say, in the way that I've approached these thematics in the first book and the second. So in Sarvanimale, The Politics of Human Weapons, which now feels very, very old to me, because it had started originally as a doctoral dissertation project many years ago, was driven by a burning question that was really important to me at the time. And this was a theoretical question, what is the meaning of sacrifice for revolutionary politics? That, I think, was the driving force of that project. How is it possible? This question became very acute as I was a doctoral student, because my doctoral study period coincided almost entirely with the period in which the political prisoners in Turkey were on a protracted hunger strike. So my question was, how is it possible that prisoners of various different stripes of affiliation to the Marxist tradition, how are they adopting en masse a form of protest that was based on self-starvation? And I thought there was something very contradictory in the life-affirming approach of Marxism in general that seeks to improve life conditions, and this very self-destructive bent of the form that was adopted by the militants. And so navigating this contradiction was sort of the existential question for the Turkish left, and for me as coming out of that tradition. And the political problem then was, can we take the prison as the real archive of Turkey's democracy? Instead of the official parliamentary sphere, instead of like the political history of coups and interruptions. Obviously there's that. But what if we look at the prison as the real or the hidden archive of Turkey's democracy? What do we see in terms of histories of repression and struggle? And what did that tell us about the changing nature of the Turkish state, the modalities of its sovereignty? So those were the questions. And on a more methodological and maybe disciplinary register, the problems for me were, can the prison be a site and source of political theorization? Can Turkey, which is often considered a kind of like exotic site, that is usually quickly tucked away into area studies, Middle East studies, can that be a site from which something new about something theoretical can be produced? And then methodologically, can ethnography be a source of that production? So those were the questions that I was dealing with. And of course, there, what was important to me was to also implicitly make a case for all of the above, and to say that actors who are militants, who are prisoners, who are usually not considered to have the epistemic standing of political thinkers with the education, the resources, the finesse, the vocabulary, can they be taken as interlocutors of, say, much more canonical Western figures like a Hobbes, a Foucault, and a Gambin? And what would that conversation be like, and what would that conversation do to how we understand political theory as such? So that was the first project. Now, turning to disembodiment, superficially, the thematics continue in the sense of like self-destruction, self-injury. But in this book's case, my problems were very different. First of all, theoretically speaking, I was extremely moved by the self-incineration of Muhammad Bouazizi, which happened as I was finishing Sarwin Inmate. But that was very, very different from the kind of actors that I was looking at. Bouazizi, what he represented, there was no movement context, no organized militancy, no existential commitment to a political cause that might eventually vindicate all of the sacrifices that are made toward that goal. Not the context of the prison, which can otherwise be said to eliminate many possibilities of forms of activism. But then why self-incineration? So politically, I think then the problem for the book became if this had been such an easy act to dismiss as a form of political despair, as suicide, as an escape, as the reaction of a depressed person, as the inability to cope with one's circumstance, a lot of discourses went in that direction. Can we sort of sort through those discourses and ask, what does this act really mean? And why are there so many individuals resorting to similar acts of self-injury, self-destruction? In fact, I mean, the statistics are quite dire, and I only found them out once I was researching this. About 700,000 people a year, most of them located in the global south, die by self-imposed or self-directed violence, let's say. So the theoretical question then became for me, what do self-destruction, self-injury, radical self-endangerment, and other bodily forms that kind of shuttle between what is voluntary and what is involuntary, what is intentional and unintentional, what is conscious and not entirely conscious, such as mass fainting episodes, spirit possession, mass illnesses, like what do these also as forms of bodily agency put together with forms of self-directed violence, fatal or non-fatal? What do they say to us about agency? What do they say to us about the role of the body, about politics, based on whether or not they're considered political? And what do they say to us, their prevalence, especially, about our present? So these were the questions. And logically speaking, the book turned out to go into a much more philosophical register. First of all, because it was impractical to do a kind of extended ethnography that I did for the first book, since the kinds of actions that I was trying to capture were much more instantaneous or fleeting, even when they were somewhat protracted. And then there's also, I think, something that we don't talk about enough, which is some of the challenges of working on violence as a scholar, and the kind of emotional and intellectual toll that, especially when you do it in an ethnographic register, that can take on you. And so I think maybe that was part of the reason why this book escapes into and finds consolation in philosophy, and away from a little bit the weight and the responsibility imposed to one by a kind of ethnographic research. But then also, I think, on a more sort of positive justification, there is, I saw that there was a lot of work that needed to be done in terms of a philosophical reworking that was necessary to change the existing conversation on and around these forms of action. So I said to myself that there are, or I identified that there were two, I would say, meta philosophical projects that shape and distort our understanding of these forms of action. And one was the problem of history, the problem of a kind of progressive philosophy of history, even in residual form, which privileges scripts of collective action as proper political action, that lead to a kind of greater freedom and equality. So that's sort of shifting or undergirding our expectations of political action. And secondly, the problem of agency, understood as free, intentional, goal-directed, and often instrumental action. And I tried to conceptualize these two issues of history and of agency as kind of posing epistemological obstacles in the Bachelardian or Althuserian sense. In other words, of ways of posing the problem that block our understanding of the problem. So on the development of a more critical theory of the same objects. So how does it do that? Well, they work together because they're deeply connected, a kind of progressivist view of history and a kind of, let's say, intentionalist, instrumentalist conception of agency, by hiding from view an entire realm of experiences, both historical and in the present, as a counter-history and maybe a counter-present. And these are erased, marginalized, sidelined, written out as contingencies in a historical narrative that doesn't really fit well with the flow of that narrative. And therefore, they don't count as real history. Or when they do, these events only enter into visibility if they have led to consequences that are major and that retroactively validate or give meaning to those actions as part of a narrative. So there's a way of building certain events into the narrative ex post facto. In the case of Bouazizi, for example, yes, because a whole series of events were, let's say, triggered by his act of self-incineration. And that led to at least temporarily successful revolutionary transformation. We can then validate that act politicality by reference to the immense repercussions that are political and politically acceptable that it has commanded. But what about the thousands of other Bouazizis who don't lead to revolutions, who don't create any major changes that can be deemed political or politically valid, and who barely even make the news? So with that question in mind, I had to go back and think through, what does it mean to be a subject? How is the subject conceptualized, especially in the Western theoretical philosophical tradition? And how is it related? How are the qualities that are imputed to the subject related to the erasure or dismissal or ignorance of self-directed acts as non-agency, basically. And also, in relation, I should mention that these acts, when they do come into the purview of theoretical reflection, of course they do, it's generally folded within two disciplines, and that's psychology and sociology. Obviously, there is the psychological analysis of, self-destructive actions, often based on intentionality and, the presence of, let's say, suicidal ideation. And oftentimes that discourse leads to an analysis of the individuals in terms of the mental disorders that they have. So that was definitely not where I wanted to go, which I find extremely depoliticizing. The other direction was the sociological one, which does not look at the agent per se, but looks at the social structure out of which that agent comes. And of course, Durkheim is someone who pioneered the study of suicide. And there you find a typology that is very well known. But just for the sake of refreshing our memory, I'll throw out a few types. So you have the egoistical or egotistical suicide juxtaposed against the altruistic. One is from excessive individualism. The other one is from excessive cohesion. And there's a clear civilizationist argument behind it, which I go in the book, and I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. And then there's another dichotomy, anomic suicides versus fatalistic suicides. But something, we can talk about this, but something was really, really interesting. So if you've seen this book or read this book, it's like a 300-page book. And Durkheim discusses extensively 3 of these types. The one that he relegates to a little footnote is fatalistic suicide. I was like, why is this like imbalance? And I'm just looking at that footnote, as the nerd in me does. And he basically says that fatalistic suicide is not important because it's no longer relevant. He gives a couple of examples: forced marriages, women who cannot have children, so like not being able to conform to social expectations of fertility. So there's a gender politics there that is very interesting. And then he says, like, oh, also, like the suicides of slaves can be called, put under this category. Actually, then he goes on to say, all suicides due to excessive physical or moral despotism can be considered under fatalistic suicide. I'm like, what? And you relegate this to a little footnote. So the rest of the project is, in a sense, exploiting that footnote to investigate through the self-destructive acts of enslaved Africans across the transatlantic crossing and in the plantations in the Americas. The hunger strikes of suffragist women in early 20th century England and Ireland, and the anti-colonial fasting practices of in India, in the ashrams of India, as different modalities, and not all of them are what Durkheim would call suicide, but I have a justification as to why we can take these together. Are ways in which that category that neutralizes the political import of self-destructive acts is upended. So I, on the one hand, go to thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Immanuel Kant to talk about how the ways in which they characterize the modern subject as rational, as self-preserving, as self-owning, as free, as having dignity, all bear the muted echoes of the kinds of struggles that were taking place at the time of their writing, which involved self-destructive acts, that by people who were in conflict with or refusing the new world order that was emerging, the new world order that was based on the modern state, the modern market, and a modern conception of man. And so I tried to reconstruct this as a kind of global, subterranean and subversive history that reaches then into the present to Bouazizi, but to the other Bouazizis, the displaced people in places like Calais or Manus Island, the asylum seekers, the factory workers in Cambodia, in Foxconn factories, etc., that have all resorted to different forms of disembodiment. How am I doing in terms of time? So that was the Parse destrance, the project, and I'll be very brief on the Parse constraints because I think my interlocutors will be probing those dimensions more. In the book, I try to be ecumenical in terms of building an alternative problematic from different currents of critical theorizing that involve Frankfurt School, that involve phenomenology, anti-colonial theory, Marxism, and various others as they pertain to the project. And what I try to do through a range of figures that include Adorno, Marcel Mauss, Helmut Plessner, Frantz Fanon, Marx and Foucault, is to say that the body is, first of all, never quite completely domesticated. And this is an important starting point because this is what allows it, in a sense, to act as a kind of reservoir of resistance. Secondly, that when there is the experience of a crisis, the crisis understood as something unanswered by rational discourse, by regular reaction, like the normal range of reactions. Sometimes what happens is that there's a disruption of our composure. And in that moment of disruption, the body's agency erupts. It erupts in a way that sometimes goes against the person. So this is something I theorize in connection with Hammond Plessner. And from Fanon, we learn that coloniality is precisely such a crisis formation, as is capitalism. And it's not just sort of the big picture crisis, but it's also in the micro crises that it creates for people. And so the undomesticability of the body, insofar as it's there, provides and fuels an alternative form of self-determination and self-assertion that I think drives the project's constructive elements. And with Marx and Foucault especially, I try to update a more materialist approach to bodily agency, because I think the body has been both something that's been extremely neglected in the Marxist tradition, but there's a lot of resources in Marx that actually can be recuperated when read in conjunction, especially with Foucault and Lanzas. And so what I try to do is to bring into visibility a whole range of bodily eruptions, let's say, that can appear, that I try to theorize under the umbrella term corporeal critique. There are many differences, and hopefully we'll get to talk about these a little bit more in depth, but it's not reducible, these forms of agency, to instrumental rationality. There's an expressive component in them as a reaction to crisis that I'm trying to, as responses to crisis that I'm trying to bring out. And I think this expressive dimension, when we pay attention to it, also goes against the main tendencies of 20th century critical theory, which see in the masses mainly complicity, mainly conformity, mainly obedience. Once you start looking from the angle of bodily agency as a kind of intimate but ever-present realm of reactions, we have to really revise those assumptions, in my opinion. Anyway, and with the Kantian concept of disembodiment that I tried to propose in this new problematic, that is an alternative to the one based on suicide and the subject, I try to position these acts as acts of refusal, acts of reclamation of or assertions of dignity, that cannot simply be dismissed as psychological disorders or social statistics. So that's sort of the big project, and I'm happy to talk and expand on any of these details. So I'm happy to leave the floor to Anna. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot for starting us off. I think that was very helpful, and some of my questions, of which I have only 3, so I mean, they all kind of touch upon what you touched upon. So I think it will be easier for people who are just starting to read the book. So first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event, and to Banu in particular, who happens to be my supervisor as well, for inviting me to speak about her work. There are many people, both within and beyond our department, who could have offered an excellent and perhaps even more insightful discussion of this book than a second-year pre-QE PhD student. And yet, they trust me. So, I accepted this invitation because I also recognize that it reflects the deep engagement and commitment our faculty has towards the professional and intellectual development of graduate students. It is in this spirit of mutual appreciation, openness, and shared dedication to critical scholarship and emancipatory thought that this discussion has been proposed, and in which I hope to pursue it. Disembodiment is a rich theoretical enterprise that will appeal to diverse audiences. In academia, these include, but not limited to, specialists in political and critical theory, post-colonial and decolonial thought, feminism, gender studies, phenomenology of embodiment, and art criticism. Beyond academia, this book will also resonate with anyone seeking to understand the current political conjuncture and engage with leftist or emancipatory politics. My intervention will not fully capture the depth of Professor Bargu's argument or the breadth of her analysis, and I acknowledge this limitation. However, I aim to highlight what I see as the book's key theoretical contributions and stakes, while inviting Banu to reflect on the choices that shape its theoretical framework. Choices that are evident in the text, but whose process of formation remains to be explored. Inevitable omissions and concessions are nothing but the flip side of the book's extremely impressive scope, and understanding how they were navigated can offer valuable insights into Banu's broader intellectual project. So from the outside, the book is characterized as guided by two interconnected questions, and we just heard them as well reformulated. So let me quote. What is the role of philosophy of history, especially a progressive or teleological philosophy of history? What is the role that this philosophy plays in shaping our perception of what constitutes political agency? Said differently, how does the absence of a progressive philosophy of history impact the ways in which we view political agency and delimit what forms of agency can be considered political at all? Even though the second question is presented as a restatement of the first one, we should not overlook a displacement that occurs between the first and second formulation. But let's begin with the first question. What is the role that the philosophy of history, especially a progressive or teleological philosophy of history, plays in shaping our perception of what constitutes political agency? The problematic set out here aligns with Althusser's and Benjamin's critique of the teleological conception of history. Here is Althusser from reading Capital, the chapter on Marx's conception of temporality. But however far philosophy goes, it can never escape the bounds of this absolute horizon. Even if it takes wing at dusk, it belongs to the day, to the today. It is still merely the present reflecting on itself, reflecting on the presence of the concept with itself. Tomorrow is in essence forbidden to it. The fact that there is no knowing the future prevents there being any signs of politics. Any knowing that deals with the future effects of the present phenomena. That is why no Hegelian politics is possible, strictly speaking. And in fact, there has never been a Hegelian politician. And here is Benjamin's formulation of the same problem. It's from the thesis of philosophy of history. Once the classless society has been defined as an infinite task, the empty and homogeneous time was transformed into an anteroom, so to speak, in which one could wait for the emergence of the revolutionary situation with more or less equanimity. What seems clear from these two citations is that for both Althusser and Benjamin, the obstacle posed by the teleological conception of history was precisely the lack of the revolution-oriented political action in the here and now. It is the passivity of the revolutionary actors that Althusser and Benjamin associate with the teleological understanding of history that itself, by merely its course, can with time deliver justice and better political consciousness to its participants. Thus, one can observe a slight displacement in the form of agency that Banu associates with belief in historical progress, in disembodiment, and intuitively rightly so. Agency that stems from teleology is intentional and goal-driven. In Banu's words, quote, the investment in the forward-looking history often privileges understanding of actions as goal-oriented. Thus, the teleological view of history and agency as intentional, goal-driven action are referred to as epistemological obstacles because these conceptions fail to account for the politicality of self-destructive actions. Bargu diagnoses the problem not with the subject's passive resignation to history, but with its too active and rushed bid on its activity. Hence, the first question is whether you see your position as different from Benjamin and Althusser. Is it a response, a hidden critique, or maybe there is no such big difference at all? Now I would like to come to the second formulation of the book's guiding question. Quote again, said differently, how does the absence of a progressive philosophy of history impact the ways in which we view political agency and delimit what forms of agency can be considered political at all? Here, though presented as a restatement by said differently, we find ourselves in a completely new problematic. What is being said is new. It is no mere restatement. The question posed and the answer hinted at, the self-immolation, self-harm, and suicide become the primary mode of resistance to the global structures of exploitation and domination in the absence of the progressive philosophy of history. Thus, we no longer need to debunk the notion of progress because our historical conjuncture has already done this work for us, and more efficiently than any intellectual critique could ever hope to achieve. Regardless of whether the modern subject was too active or too passive, the contemporary global situation is characterized by the absence of a progressive philosophy of history. What is more, it is this exacerbated neoliberal condition that calls for the inclusion of corporeal agency into the repertoire of the oppressed as expressive enactments of dignity and humanity. The opposition between Muhammad Muazzidi and Turkish communist poet and writer Nazım Hikmet's poem about Banerjee set forth in the first chapter is extremely illuminating. Banerjee's suicide is rational, calculated, motivated by the service to the party and the revolution. Bargu compares the self-killing of Banerjee to the famous dual suicide of Laura and Paul Lafargue, who took their own lives at the age of 66 and 69 respectively, because they could not be of use to the international communist cause. 1963, the year Nazım Hikmet dies, in Bargu's presentation marks the turning point for the global proliferation of public acts of self-destruction. Bouazizi's self-immolation that sparked the popular uprising against Ben Ali in Tunisia lacked both goal-oriented rationality and the collectivity to which this sacrifice could be addressed. Referring to astounding figures of death caused by self-inflicted violence in Chapter 2, the other Bouazizis of our times, and pointing toward the global south at the site of these acts, including the self-killings of urban poor in Mexico, Egypt, Morocco, young women in Iraqi Kurdistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, Foxconn workers in China, workers in France's telecom, prisoners in Greece, farmers in South Korea and India, prisoners strike in Guantanamo Bay, and many more heartbreaking cases, Bargu underscores the peculiarity of this disparate act of self-destruction. I quote, this commonality is that their aftermath does not enable their retroactive enfolding into a narrative of liberation, nor does it enable the attribution of the status of martyrdom to these actors. Thus, Bargu underscores that the seemingly similarity is superficial and that self-destruction has both a new meaning and a new role to play in politics. At the same time, in Chapter 4, Bargu traces the global subterranean subversive history of suicide and self-mutilation, citing examples of massive death acts of the enslaved resisting transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century, the feminist hunger strikes in the early 20th century England, and Gandhian fasting practices. I would like to use this opportunity to have Banu's help on elucidating the relationship between the counter-history or alternative lineage of modernity and the uniqueness and peculiarity of self-destruction that marks the neoliberal age. In other words, is there anything unique and specific in the current conjuncture that puts primacy on self-destruction? And should we continue insisting that Boaziz's case is remarkably different from not only Bella Parks, but even Jan Paula or Bobby Sands? Or conversely, the forms of corporeal agency, which become salient in the neoliberal age, have been there in latent forms, but in the neoliberal condition, when other forms of resistance turn somehow unavailable, what remains is resistance through bodily agency that cannot be subsumed by neither reason nor the state or capital or the market. And the last question. So the whole project is inspiring and illuminating in its attempt not only to criticize the dominant conceptions of what constitute emancipatory political action, but also in its attempt to rescue the always already there modes of political action, which are not readable as such because of epistemological biases or obstacles. The book gives vivid examples of the struggles of the oppressed masses or the struggling oppressed class of the global south, these are all in quotation marks, happening in remote and not so remote locations. I would like to invite Banu to talk more about the use of such concepts as the oppressed masses, the damned of the earth, and the struggling oppressed class in her work. To outline possible concerns about these uses, we might think about the stakes in terminology. For instance, in the orthodox Marxist accounts, these accounts focused on the category of the working class. Why? One answer could be that capitalism was unique in a way that it destroyed all other affiliations and collective statuses while creating conditions for economy to become the main driving factor behind the formation of collective interest. And it was in the interest of the working class to overthrow capitalism as a system. The benefit of this view was the admission that the whole of humanity, as it was, did not share in the revolutionary struggle. However, the concept working class had two main problems. It could only be applied to industrially developed countries, and it was biased toward the inherent revolutionary subjectivity of the Western working class. Bargu turns to these shortcomings in chapter 8 and deals with revisions introduced by Althusser and Raymond Williams, and the others as well. Let's also remind ourselves of other tracks these revisions followed. First of all, among Marxists and socialists. Italian communist and the epitome of revolutionary self-sacrifice, Antonio Gramsci, came up with the term classi subalterni, which gained recognition by subaltern studies while losing the link between these classes and the working class hegemony, which was the crucial point for Gramsci. Fanon's use of the damned of the earth is, of course, a direct reference to Jean Gaultier's Anti-Mode International and a gesture towards reevaluating the West-centered idea of the peasantry's reactionary character, so-called. Importantly, Fanon was among the most vehement critics of the petty and national bourgeoisie, thus retaining the signature thesis of Marxist class analysis in the 18th Brumaire. E.P. Thompson, in seminal The Making of the English Working Class, underscored how heterogeneous groups of artisans and agrarian workers, through their struggles in the late 18th century, gradually performed the transformation of the working classes in the plural into the working class in singular. Bolivar describes this transformation as the political process of subject formation, which had always been contingent and never spontaneously sprang from the capitalist exploitation and production. Thus, class could be made and unmade, and it is this neoliberal unmaking that set the stage for Bargu's intervention. Since the late 80s, the discussion of political subjects revolved around populism and the struggles for hegemony. The unmaking of the working class was recognized, even though rather prematurely, and the new concepts such as precariat or the multitude were proposed, with the people remaining the dominant form of political interpolation. While the concept of class had its many shortcomings, it was also uniquely effective in linking various struggles internationally as a response to the global scope of capitalism, and it is this global scope that challenged the concept itself with such innovations as the East, the colonial, and later, and already as a disjuncture, the Third World and the non-aligned. This is a very brief and possibly a shoe sketch of left-wing experiments with political subjectivity that provide the background for Bargu's reconceptualization and political agency. So I will reiterate the question that would help us again gain a better understanding of the stakes in violent intervention. Why did you opt for the global South, the struggling oppressed class, and the oppressed masses? Could these be viewed as interchangeable? What aspects of the previously used concepts would you like to retain, and which of them are you seeking to overcome with the terminology you propose? What are the errors you're trying to correct, and what has been done for these efforts to be successful? Last but not least, what forms of political action, mass mobilization, organization, and international cooperation do you think these concepts could invite us to? Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to write another book.
Do you want to respond to that, or should I keep going? Okay. Okay. I think some of this will resonate, hopefully. But yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Banu, for this invitation. I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with your work and with you, Anna. And I do welcome you to any disruptions or involuntary eruptions in remarks. Okay. So at first blush, one might expect Banu Bargu's new book, Disembodiment, to be about the dead, dying, and suffering body, about hunger, exploitation, immiseration, indebtedness, unemployment, displacement, abjection, disposability. And it is about this, of course, but that is not all. As an object, the suffering body does not exhaust the generative scope of the project, nor the normative force of its argument. Bargu's book is about the suffering body, but it is also at one and the same time animated by a commitment to what Marx in Capital calls the living body, the body that experiences suffering and that confronts the unanswerability of its crisis conditions with acts of resistance, those which emerge from beneath and that constantly displace and redefine the boundaries of what we call the political. Refusing to fully identify the suffering body with its objectification in global capitalist society, with its apparent status of victimhood or lack of agency, Bargu defends what she calls its undomesticable excess, which he's already talked about. From the dehumanizing violence wrought on the colonial subject to the hellish plight of factory workers that Marx situates at the heart of capital, the human body is dominated, but it is never domesticated. It is this wager on the corporeal openness of the human, what Bargu terms somatic plenitude, that I think really defines the spirit, or what we might better call the living body of the work. Disembodiment is a deeply creative and in my opinion, a bravely experimental book that charts an epistemic path of theorization and struggle between the North and South, from everyday human suffering to everyday human resistance, and along the way offering up a forceful expression of what it means to do global critical theory in the present. So in the Althusserian spirit of drawing a line of demarcation, but at the risk of failing to do justice to the undomesticable quality of the book, I would like in these remarks to focus on a particular aspect of Bargu's project, one that I think constitutes much of the orienting impetus of her argument, and this is the role of phenomenology. The significance of phenomenology for Bargu's project becomes especially evident in the middle of the book, within the chapter on corporeal critique, which develops a theory of somatization, in part through a reading of the German philosopher Helmut Plessner, whom she places in conversation, among others, with Franz Fanon. So I won't go into her analysis, Bargu's analysis of Plessner, but maybe that's something we can talk about if it's relevant. I think that Bargu's serious engagement with phenomenology cuts against the grain of the critical theory tradition. With several notable exceptions, there has been a long-standing suspicion towards phenomenology in critical theory and within critical Marxist thought more broadly. The phenomenological approach, with its alleged overemphasis on consciousness and immediacy, is deemed antithetical to the political and philosophical aims of historical materialism. This suspicion can be traced back, perhaps, to Adorno's work, particularly his critique of Husserl and what was to be published as Against Epistemology, along with his famously scathing treatment of Heidegger's jargon of authenticity. In the last few years, however, there has been a growing interest in reconsidering the relationship between critical theory and phenomenology, as well as the possibility and contemporary relevance of a phenomenological Marxism, whose 20th century lineage Bargu details in her book as running through the early Lukács, Sartre, and Zopaci and the early Merleau-Ponty. This return to phenomenology has been bolstered in part by the emergence of the field of critical phenomenology, which has, among other things, questioned the Eurocentrism of traditional phenomenological assumptions. There have also been recent attempts to consider and reformulate phenomenological analysis as critique. But most important, there seems to be a growing intuition that phenomenology, in its attempt to take experience seriously, has something critically useful to offer in our moment of global crisis, insofar as that crisis is felt increasingly, though unevenly, in the everyday lived course of struggle. So my contention is that Disembodiment provides an important contribution to this project of critically and politically reclaiming phenomenology, particularly through its critique of the Western metaphysics of the constitutive subject, which continues to pervade much of the Husserlian tradition, its phenomenological reading of Marx, its situating of embodiment alongside historical forms of disembodiment, and its attempt to think bodily agency in terms that precede or are anterior to more traditional accounts of reflection and intentionality, and that demand an engagement with the uneven geographies of capital accumulation, suffering, and struggle. Particularly important, I think, is Bargu's engagement with the phenomenological problem of lived experience as refracted through the approach of global critical theory. I'm interested in the extent to which a critically reworked notion of lived experience operates in the book as a practical concept, to draw again on Bargu's Althusserian lexicon. As Bargu discusses in the book, a practical concept is one that can be read as a practical signal, pointing out a direction and destination, but without giving an adequate concept of it. The orienting dimension of lived experience is displayed, I believe, on the first page of the book's initial chapter, which begins with a discussion of the 1932 poem, Why Did Banerjee Kill Himself?, by the Turkish communist poet Nazim Hikmet, as Anna has already discussed. As Bargu describes it, the poem is a eulogy for the figure of Banerjee, who shoots himself in the head upon release from prison. But at the same time, the poem also, quote, redirects the question of suicide away from a binary between moral approval or condemnation to one that urges us to think it differently, in reference to lived experience of the conditions and events that shape one's actions in ways that complicate a paradigm of action ensuing from instrumental rationality, end quote. In this passage, it is the lived or experientially imminent character of crisis that orients us towards, that practically signals a form of corporeal critique that calls into question the modern Western concept of the subject, as a subject rooted in qualities of self-preservation, self-ownership, and moral autonomy. The historical intolerability of lived experience within global capitalist society, what Bargu calls the unanswerability of crisis conditions, demands rethinking the question of the subject from the subpolitical level of bodily suffering and the involuntary eruptions of affliction, discontent, and despair into the spaces of the present. In this regard, I read Bargu as offering a radical reframing of the Frankfurt School problematic of the crisis of experience. One of the major through lines of the first generation of the Frankfurt School was a diagnosis of capitalist modernity in terms of experiential impoverishment, whether through the fragmentation of continuous experience in Benjamin, the liquidation of the individual in Adorno, or the solidification of one-dimensional thought in Marcuse. For readers of the Frankfurt School, there has been perhaps a persistent temptation to interpret this crisis of experience as calling for the recovery of what has been lost. However, by focusing on the suffering body and by articulating that body within the global context of uneven development, Bargu charts a different path. Rather than seeking the recovery of a lost experiential whole, the wager on disembodiment assumes a more politically productive stance with regard to the crisis of experience. Unanswerable on the reflective level of logos, today's crisis of experience, when viewed from the standpoint of bodily suffering, forces the question of the subject underground, so to speak, to engage with a non-evental history of radical refusal. It is this subterranean history of corporeal acts that, as Bargu lucidly demonstrates in the case of Adorno and Horkheimer, simultaneously sits at the normative core of much early Frankfurt School writing, while remaining under-examined and perhaps unsurprisingly underdeveloped. Zeroing in on this limitation, Bargu's project of corporeal critique shifts the problematic from the crisis of experience to the actual experiences of crisis, experiences that lie beneath and beyond the instrumentalist framework of agency. Okay, so in the remainder of my remarks, in the hopes of generating some questions for discussion, I want to very schematically sketch out 3 general lines of inquiry that I see disembodiment opening up. The first concerns the issue of space. Second concerns the question of political consciousness or class consciousness. And the third concerns the problem of teleology, which you've already discussed on. It seems to me that problems of space, scale, and displacement play a very important role in the argumentative fabric of disembodiment. This is especially evident in Bargu's chapter titled Throwaway Bodies, Gestures of Refusal from the Global South, which builds on Sylvia Wynter's global conceptualization of throwaway lives and engages with the relationship between the crisis conditions of global capitalism, uneven geographical development, and new forms of territorialization. Crucial to the analysis is Bargu's treatment of the Global South as a political normative category that, as she says, is far from homogeneous insofar as it combines critical geographies of suffering with critical geographies of resistance and refusal. If disembodiment seeks to trace a subterranean history or non-history of marginalized bodily acts, can we say that it also implies something similar on the level of space, a kind of negative geography or non-space of refusal? What is the relationship, in other words, between time and space, history and geography in Bargu's project? And what can this tell us about the prospects of global critical theory today? To explore these questions further, I would like to think a little more about the spatial dimensions of the notions of bodily suffering and bodily agency that are developed in the book. From the perspective of the critique of political economy, we might consider how the living body as an indelible aspect of the commodity of labor power functions vis-a-vis the production of space and scale. So I think a crucial element of Bargu's reading of Marx is a focus on cooperation, as premised on the animation of bodily energies and vitality, leading to the creation of a new collective force. I'm interested in thinking more about the link between cooperation, the management of the body of the worker, and the spatial organization of society. Marx famously describes how cooperation extends the spatial scale of production through the building of railroads, irrigation systems, etc., through the simultaneous compression of the space of production, circumscribing labor within a single factory, for instance. It seems to me that Bargu's analysis of the living body as a body that suffers and viscerally resists may help us critically understand the ways in which these large-scale, global, seemingly limitless transformations of space both rely on and come into frictional contact with everyday experiences of embodied suffering. I think the political consequences of this are quite clear and need to be unpacked a little bit. So beneath the abstract spaces of capitalist society, we might seek to map what Walter Benjamin called body space, a sphere of collective political action in which, he said, no limb remains untorn. Okay. Second, I want to briefly raise the problem of political subjectivity or consciousness, and in particular, the old Lukácsian question of class consciousness. So on the one hand, Bargu's book offers a clear challenge to the instrumentalist framework of agency, which he argues assumes, quote, a rational, intentional, fully conscious subject whose motivations are transparent and knowable to the self, end quote. At the same time, her analysis of Plessner's notion of an eccentric position, which I won't really go into here, does place a premium on reflexivity in a way that I think allows us to reconsider the critical and political role of consciousness in a more phenomenological direction, albeit one that challenges the classical focus on intentionality, reflection, and objectification. I'm interested in how Bargu's concept of bodily agency might lend itself to rethinking the question of the revolutionary subject or class consciousness in a manner that foregrounds the role of what phenomenologists call pre-reflective self-consciousness or self-awareness, a consciousness of self that operates prior to its thematization and objective thought. It was this direction that thinkers such as Sartre and Merleau-Ponty were moving towards in their critical assessment of the work of Lukács. In the work of the Vietnamese Marxist philosopher Tran Duc Thao shows how the concept of pre-reflective experience can lend itself to a critical analysis of colonial relations. And here he was very influential, we think, on phenomena. So I'll leave it there in the hopes of maybe a further discussion. Okay. Finally, and I'll go through this quickly since you've already done such a nice job, I think, unpacking the question of teleology here. But to repose the question of the revolutionary subject from the vantage of bodily agency is also, I would argue, to repose the question of teleology. Interestingly, the problem of teleology appears both at the very beginning and the very end of disembodiment. Early on, Bargu seeks to trace a global subterranean history of the struggling oppressed beneath the hegemonic narrative of the modern subject and its attendant qualities of self-preservation and self-proprietorship. For Bargu, the excavation of this counter-history, which in turn functions to decenter the Western Northern canon of political thought, entails what she refers to as the displacement of teleology. While she aims to recuperate and theorize the meaning and implications of a subterranean history, this must be done, she argues, quote, without relying on a progressive narrative that enfolds the actions in it, or holding at bay any philosophy of history that may be relied upon to validate these actions. However, in the final pages of the book, the problem of teleology emerges again. This time, its stakes have been transformed. In a lucid moment of self-critique, which we could all use more of, I think, Bargu observes that the most important limitation of her project is that it is, quote, based on a leap of faith, end quote. This book, she says, these are her words, asserts the undomesticability, never say that word, undomesticability of the body as the source of a different teleology, the teleology of emancipation from oppression. However, this is nothing more than a performative teleology, a term you're drawing from Kant, I believe, with the full awareness that such an ontological assertion is ultimately that, an assertion of a last instance. So this is an open question, but I'm interested in the extent to which Bargu's phenomenological approach, perhaps, to disembodiment and embodiment helps propel this alternative conception of teleology. So perhaps we could consider the possibility of something like a weak teleology, a telos that appears in a negative sense within the historical suffering and destitution of human life, a telos generated, so to speak, from its own failure, from futures piteously blocked. Bargu's work shows us that if such a weak teleology is worth defending today, it is never weak, however, since it is constituted by bodies that resist.
Thank you so much. Just a few moments. Thank you so much for these very rich responses. I mean, I will not be able to do justice to any of the points that you've raised. Let me try to speak briefly and hopefully touch upon them, but feel free to nudge me if I glide over some of these. I think Anna's opening comments and Key's closing comments kind of come full circle in terms of highlighting the political stakes for the project for me, or the political nature of my own intervention, in the sense that which I theorized as a kind of maybe self-reflexive moment, as you were saying, Key, at the end of, okay, so we've displaced the teleology of history. We are no longer, we're free, let's say, of the shackles of a kind of narrative of progress, but doesn't what I'm doing kind of transpose that possibility now in a more spatial, perhaps, register of the space of the body in its undomesticability. I don't know if I should be able to say domesticability as a kind of new horizon of possibility, a new outside, a new, as I say, a kind of like weak or political ontology that ultimately non-provable. Yes, perhaps that is the case, but I often console myself by thinking the reverse. What have we gained by seeing the body as acculturated all the way down, as domesticated entirely, as subjectified entirely by ideology? We already know the result of that thought experiment. And that has led us to the impasse of critical theory. So perhaps, and I'm not saying this is a truth or the answer, but shifting the register from a temporal horizon in which we are bound to be disappointed because the revolution isn't happening, and the masses are not acting the way they're supposed to act. They're fragmented, they're reified, they have false consciousness or they're improper subject. What happened if we try to think, well, in fact, beyond and beneath the level of the political, there is so much going on. I try to call it the sub-political level for various reasons that I can go into, because it's partly subconscious or pre-reflective. What if we start building up from there? And hence the use of the terms such as the struggling oppressed rather than simply the oppressed or the victims or those who are rendered marginal or those who are outcast or the subjugated, to recuperate an element, an active element in that presence of the suffering body, which is not simply suffering passively. In its suffering, it's already actively reacting. So what if we start building up from the body, as it were, understood as the only thing that people have left, and to think of that both historically as a chain that connects us to the enslaved Africans across the ocean, to the women who are struggling for the vote, to the anti-colonial struggles, but also in the present. So a different conception is, or this is the question, is an alternative conception of globality, of universality, of history possible when we start taking the body and its active forces, its vital forces, as the assumption, and it is an assumption. So that's I think perhaps a strength, perhaps a weakness of the project, in that at least it's aware of that limitation or boundary, in the sense that there's no real escape from the problem. But I mean, in philosophy, where is there escape from any problem? It's just alternative ways of formulating the same problem, perhaps. So yeah, it does build on Althusser and Benjamin, but also with respectful distance to some of the assumptions that they continue to make, while they criticize the Hegelian conception of history, and some of them have already come out. There is a residual investment in Althusser that's undeniable in the revolutionary possibility of the masses, and therefore, even though there's a foregoing of historical teleology, that investment, I think, brings from the back door what he's throwing out from the window. Similarly, I think, both of you have alluded to the poet Nazım Hikmet, whose life world is really shaped by the imaginary of the left. And you see in his poetry and the way he understands and gives meaning to acts of revolutionary sacrifice is precisely undergirded by that belief of eventual vindication. When you take that away, and Anna, you're absolutely on point to say that I think our present has taken that away. It's not something that we have to remove it as a thought experiment. What remains then is either to try to think of an alternative that you can build up with the elements that you have, or an appeal to a new form of interpolation or subjectivity, revolutionary subjectivity, as many other thinkers have done. And I think that's also a worthy endeavor. In a certain way, I partake of that with the category of the global South, and I use that as a normative and political category, with the understanding of it through a kind of an inflection that's brought by a kind of thinking that passes through Fanon and Sylvia Wynter in their understanding of a new humanity that is made possible by participation in a kind of struggle, in a kind of resistance. So again, the emphasis on the struggling part of the struggling oppressed, and not simply the experience of oppression. Space is something that I think is really missing in the book. It's not theorized. It's not thought through, except for a kind of a discourse of unevenness that I think characterizes some of the arguments that I developed to differentiate different forms within the global South and across the North and the South. But I think it is a blind spot, I would say, of the project that I'm aware of. But there's only so much one can do. And I think the emphasis on reworking phenomenology, or trying to open up this conversation with phenomenology, between phenomenology and the critical tradition, is really important, because I think some of those gestures of the critical tradition, precisely about the complicity of the masses, the conformity, hegemony, ideological state apparatuses, like you name it, all of 20th century critical thinking is based on one form of it or another. It does build itself largely on the shutting out of experience as a valid source of understanding. And I think the reversal of that is really important, or at least a conversation that opens that up to thinking. I'm not saying an absolute embrace of a kind of positivism, but I think there's something there that maybe was foregone too quickly. And I think recuperating that is a source of hope and a source of rejuvenation also for the tradition. There's a lot more I can say, but maybe in the interest of opening the conversation, I can pause here for a moment, and Max, you will moderate. I look at you.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for comments and questions. Ingrid and Robert.
Thank you, Banu. We never talk about your work, so this is the first time I heard about your work, and this very informed discussion, and so it's a treat for me. But I have to apologize, I haven't read your book, so I'm going to ask a rather uninformed question. I like very much the idea of the struggling oppressed, right? So So to me, that indicates this sort of resistance is different, or this kind of a violent resistance is different from a lot of pre-modern or early modern form of violence or resistance, precisely because it is in this system of industrial capitalism. And it's not meaningless sort of self-destruction, right? So it has an intention of protesting. So how do we, in however ways we can measure the efficacy of such a protest? On the flip side of this question is because they are other non-political forms of self-immolation, right? So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you punish, you whip your own body, and in the Buddhist tradition, you burn your fingers, not as a political protest, right? So in that sort of a pre-modern form of violence, it does not address this kind of political protest we have in our time. So how do you draw the line here, historically, to separate this kind of modern protest, right, by measuring its efficacy from any kind of pre-modern form of the violent reaction?
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, you go.
I am okay. Anyway, thank you so much. So this is a question that has preoccupied me, and my solution to drawing a line has been to really situate a break in early modernity. I'm not saying these sorts of practices never existed before. Clearly they did. There are historical precedents. But I think a whole different study would be needed to assess their significance in their own context. I say this because the way I've been interpreting early modern to contemporary acts is very much in relation to the modern conception of subjectivity. Without that, the subversiveness or the radicality or the politicality of these acts cannot be understood. That's like the contrast concept. And I spend a lot of time in the book delineating the qualities of that subject that then are upended by these forms of action. Now, in a pre-modern or non-modern context, that contrast is absent. And therefore, I think the meaning of these acts will be quite different. Now, I draw the line sort of let's say 16th century, and therefore, and especially because they were so important in the building of the modern world, I incorporate the acts of enslaved Africans into the building of the modern world, especially because I read that not simply as an escape or resignation, as sometimes has been attributed for people, for example, throwing themselves overboard, but precisely as an act of refusal or an act of dignity that I feel that it's not a big violence to incorporate those actions into this narrative of modernity, a counter history of modernity that I'm trying to offer. But for example, it comes up in the discussions around fasting, and Gandhian fasting practices offers the curious point of contact, perhaps you could say, between a very modern conception of hunger striking and a different understanding of self-starvation as a form of decolonizing the body and asserting ascetic forms of self-control, etc., that have much more in common with, one can say, non-Western and non-modern forms of bodily practices. And I try to bring out that as an alternative sort of current that feeds into some of and gets re-articulated with some of the contemporary understandings of subjecthood, colonized subjecthood in the 20th century. So I think it's a very important point that you're making, and thank you for bringing that up, because the book's premise is built on a kind of break with modernity that signified these acts in a different way than previously. And then this is not to say all in modernity are the same. Obviously, 20th century and in the contemporary, let's say under neoliberal capitalism, they have different significations. And I try to bring that out as well, because clearly, 17th century, 18th century acts and contemporary acts cannot be necessarily the same. But what I'm trying to do is to establish the presence of a kind of continuity, or at least to give our understanding of contemporary acts a tradition that existed, though it was not conceived of as a tradition, nor did it conceive itself as partaking in a tradition. But nonetheless, I think retroactively, we can try to bring these into an alternative narrative of counterhistory as historical precedents.
Thank you.
Robert.
Thank you, Banu. I thought that also the comments were really incredible and rich. Let me start just by saying how incredibly impressed I am by the book. I mean, this is for those of you who haven't read it, this is a big book, and not just in the sense of the number of pages, but I just am blown away by the breadth of material, the different levels of analysis, the way in which it is all kind of integrated and woven together. It's just an extraordinary achievement. I think it's a triumph. And I'm very appreciative of the chance to read it closely and to talk with you about it. Sort of in the spirit of kind of collegial respect, and how part of our profession is in exchanging critical comments. I want to offer one response, partially because I want to know what the answer to this question is, not because I think I know the answer to it. And it probably comes from someone who does cling more still stubbornly to a more kind of universalistic conception, probably still to some concepts of universal mystery, teleology, and so on, or at least thinks that those are hard to drop altogether, that they come back in often. So, and I think it comes out here in my reading in two ways. The first is the question about what is the purpose of the book. And that to me, there's a kind of tension in here between, on the one hand, a desire to reveal and honor a certain kind of constellation of practices around disembodiment, while at the same time, as I read it, there is a latent desire to bring about a world in which those practices would be less necessary. So in other words, there's a kind of tension, and I think it's a productive tension, between a desire to, in a sense, like honor and dignify these things, but also to diminish or attenuate their necessity. And so if that's true, if the second gesture, the desire to bring about some kind of a world, then it would seem that the act of writing the book, the act of critique, is in some minimal sense teleological, as in trying to bring about some condition that would ameliorate, rather than merely revel in the fact of corporeal critique and disembodiment, but rather to reframe it in such a way that it would eventually extinguish itself, or at least be severely diminished. So that's, I guess, one way of thinking about how I see kind of teleological conception of collective politics and critique is coming back. A second has to do with, I guess, what you might call like the case selection. Why these acts versus some others? So as I was reading the book, I thought of a couple of like counter cases that I'm curious what you think of. And this seems like I'm going to kind of overstate the claim a little bit just for the purpose of clarity. So one example is Yukio Mishima, who's the Japanese fascist who, after the Second World War, tried to continue on the struggle. He founded like a highly militaristic, masculinist society, that they were misogynists, they were deeply xenophobic, and they tried to restore, the imperial and fascist struggle. And he committed ritualistic suicide in order to, he thought if this was going to bring about the restoration of the imperium and rise up all these young men who had been his followers. And so he committed a kind of ritualistic suicide in that. So I choose him because it's a kind of global South figure who is a misogynist and a xenophobic fascist, right, who does commit an act of self-destruction in some way to bring about that form of politics. And another figure I thought of as I was reading the book is the child in the scene where Fanon is interpolated, the little girl. So most people, of course, focus on Fanon and that his embodied revolt against being interpolated as Black, but there is also a kind of embodied revolt that happens from the child. And I choose the child there in part because, like, the association with children is that they're less acculturated into our societies in a diminished way than, say, adults. But it's a kind of example, a small example of which there are many of people who. So to put the two of the figures combined is there are lots of misogynists, racists, homophobes, who at a very visceral, embodied level reject equality with others. They can't stand being in the same room as women, or what they take to be almost like a visceral revulsion against the idea of having to share space and smell the same air and so on as people of color and whatnot. So they, from a subjective perspective, would see themselves as engaged in corporeal revolts and as the struggling oppressed. But I take it from the case selection of the book that you don't consider them part of that, and I would not also. Right? But then that means that there is this distinction between a subjective revolt, however embodied, and objective conditions of oppression. These people are just objectively not oppressed. And so, but if there's an objective standard for oppression, that seems again to bring in something, to me, like some kind of a more universalistic conception that has to impose itself upon. It cannot just acknowledge and honor embodied revolts, right, from the subjective standpoint. And so that, I guess, is the other thing I was wondering in terms of like the case selection. Are there fascistic, misogynistic, homophobic embodied revolts against the subjective experience of suffering, the suffering that comes with having to live in equality with others?
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so yes, is there a tension between the desire to acknowledge these practices as practices of refusal and dignity versus a world where there is dignity accorded to everybody, and therefore these forms of micro-crises do not propel humans to act this way? Of course. I think that productive tension drives all of our work. But I'm very sober about the limitations of intellectual work and what it can do. I don't think we're all that important, and definitely not effective. And if that were my belief, I think I might have tried to go into policy or something like that, which is not my forte anyway. So, but in that ineffectivity and a world of many limitations, I still think that it is worthy to try to change the terms of how we look at something, because it opens up new and unpredictable ways of thinking that actually may have repercussions that are much more beyond, what I intended as an author. So I think about how my ideas have been generated with so many different encounters that may or may not have been in line with the authors of those ideas and works, or how they intended it to be received. I think it's important still to try. So I'm not resigned either. But I have a very, I think, sober assessment of really what the limitations of what we do are. Now, in terms of case selection, of course, there are, we can proliferate the examples of people who, act as, human shields before abortion clinics. People who attack, others on the basis of their religious differences in a kind of, self and other destroying forms. So, there are so many. I purposefully do not talk about those forms in the book. I don't want to give them more airspace, and that's not my problem. But I do very briefly touch upon it when I'm discussing Fanon, not in the example of the child, but in the example of how, in the clinic, Fanon spots very similar forms of psychosomatic disorders, not simply in the people who have undergone torture at the hands of the colonial regime, but also in the torturers themselves and their families. And the symptoms are not very different from one another. But I think that's a good thing, because that means that there is something salvageable in everybody. I'm not saying let's try to transform the torturers, but I don't also want to absolutize the distinction. And this also comes up maybe a little bit in the chapter on From the Maze to Guantanamo, because I comment there on Steve McQueen's incredible film, if anyone hasn't watched it, called Hunger, where you see a kind of juxtaposition between the prisoner and the prison guards, who are both, in a way transformed by the experience of the hunger struck. And that possibility of transformation, self-transformation, is very important to me politically. And I think that the corporeal basis of that self-transformation is the same. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying every act is necessarily going to take, in a politically progressive direction. It may not even move so far as to become political in the conventional sense. But that possibility, that basis, is, I think, I come closest to a conception of the universal. And I don't want to forego that, even though I think, there is definitely selection bias, if you want, in the way that I frame it, and in the examples that I put forward. But also, I like the imperfections of the people who are resorting to these practices, even when I find it important to talk about their experiences as a form of oppression, in the sense that, you know, just because someone is registering their deep refusal to being indignified doesn't necessarily mean their politics is something I would, or their views in other areas of life I would see eye to eye. But I'm bracketing all of that out in order perhaps to excessively amplify this one dimension that I think is just tends to fall out of our sight. Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions.
Is there any other question? So otherwise I have to collect the questions. Sometimes there is a short. Yeah, I know. You go.
Okay. Thank you, John. It's fascinating. I'm really excited to read the book. I'm curious to know more about the people who commit acts of self-destruction, self-immolation. What have they said about? Do they say why they do it? Do they leave behind letters? Do you look at them? Are there implicit theories and explanations for why they do that? And maybe that might speak to this conversation that you were just having.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thank you, Evan. Well, this is not something that I've looked at extensively for this book, but one of my former doctoral students, Sarah Hassani, who worked on on women in the Persian Gulf, their self-immolations. She actually did an incredible field work talking to survivors who didn't end up dying after going through the brutal experience of self-immolation or incineration. And what came out as a finding that's really, really interesting is that very few people actually intended to die. It's more an outburst of anger, of frustration, of this unanswerability, this sense of refusal, despair, like all of those things combined, this overwhelming sense of kind of no, that motivated a lot of these acts, and they're not necessarily contemplated either. They're mostly spontaneous. I'm not saying it cannot be contemplated. Obviously, the example of a hunger strike is very different, can be very, very different. But it could also start very spontaneously under torture, for example. I know of many examples that kind of spontaneous reaction to violence. So I thought that is really interesting because it first of all, for me, undermines even further some of the paradigms of intentionality or suicidal ideation and stuff like that that is usually used to make meaning of these acts. But also, just showing the range, the complexity of human experiences and the lack of transparency, in a sense, of ourselves to ourselves at any given moment. The idea that we know what we're doing seems to be largely a problematic assumption. So I don't know to what extent that speaks back to Robert's question or the examples that he used, but this is something that was eye-opening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to reading your book as I've been, preparing for my key. I haven't gotten to crack it up. It's a mea culpa on that. But I wondered if you could say a little bit about how to think of like two axes in relation to each other. One being the pre-reflective and the reflective, and the other being the irrational and the rational. Because it seems to me that a Hegelian might simply say, well, these are just irrational excesses. and we don't need to think about them beyond that. But I take you to be saying that, part of the meaningfulness of these cases has to do with the way that, they appear as attempts to end one's own suffering, to index some form of injustice, and or mobilize collective action. And this is what makes them legible as political. So it seems to me that there's some, because even if I don't think we have to think of these as necessarily being cases where people are self-conscious about some intended goal or something like that. But nonetheless, there's a sort of framework within which this, even if it's a sort of intuitive or even emotional response by which one, is dealing with some sort of contradiction or something like this, thinking about, the meaningfulness and, whether it's rational or irrational and how that relates to pre-reflective or reflective. I'm just talking in circles, but maybe this makes sense.
Sean, I don't use irrational.
But
I hope I don't. I think I have proved the book several times over. If I do, I will be very mad at myself.
But my only reason to bring that up is because of Hegel.
Yeah. So no, I understand. So I abstain from using that dichotomy, especially because this is precisely a dichotomy, say in Hobbes, for example, you find, the martyr, the figure of the martyr is equated with the figure of the fool, who is crazy, irrational. Why would you not preserve yourself? That's the motivating question that leads up to the whole paradigm of liberalism and the modern state. So that is a dichotomy that I think is challenged by these acts, insofar as they do not ascribe to the kind of subjectivity upon which rationality is imputed as equated with self-preservation. The pre-reflective is a different distinction. And I think that brings us precisely into the domain of phenomenology. And here, I have been really informed by my engagement with the critical phenomenology of Hans Plessner and his conceptualization of the human as an eccentric being. What does that mean? It means that you are, first of all, aware that you are in a body, that you're embodied, but that you also have a body. So it's a kind of dual quality of being a body and having a body. But that's not just it. There's a third dimension of being aware that you are both and reducible to neither. And a fourth dimension is that when you engage with other humans, you're aware that they have that triple dimension as well. So that creates a very different relationality to your body, to yourself, to the other, to the world, to the relation between bodies and persons. So in that context, the pre-reflective, reflective has an entirely different connotation than rational, irrational. And that's the kind of ambiguity that I insert all these like mass painting episodes, for example, that they gain meaning in the fact that you are a body and you have your body to do something, but it's quite neither. It's very hard to locate. And the thinkers who have folded these acts in a kind of instrumentalist rationality, and I'm thinking here, and maybe this is a little bit to also honor his work, Jim Scott, the hidden transcripts, the infrapolitics. There's an element there of similar protests, but for him, these are all guised forms of action in order to avoid the consequences of being caught in a political act, of a confrontation. That's not what I'm saying at all. I really want to emphasize the expressivity as a kind of necessary reaction that is, again, pre-reflective, reflective, it depends, but can be both. But that doesn't fall onto this like rational, irrational binary.
Thank you, Banu. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm excited to do it. I wanted to ask two questions. They're really simple and short. The first one has to do with your early work and writing about fearless speech and silence as a form of speech act, which I found really compelling. And I wondered if you think about this as a kind of speech act and why it isn't like that kind of speech act that you were thinking about earlier in your work. And then the other question is a more sort of cultural specificity question. And that question has to do with the fact that does the figure that you're working with rely, as you suggest, on the modern subject being a kind of individual?
Mm-hmm.
Or can it also extend to cultural infrastructures that are different from European, US, American kind of notions of subjectivity that emphasize the individual? In contrast, other cultural paradigms, and I'm coming back to Japan, for example, that emphasize the collective, wherein ritual suicide would be expected to launch behaviors of others, mm-hmm. unlike a ritual suicide in a cultural context in which the individual is seen as separate. Mm-hmm. So I wonder about the cultural specificity, potentially, of the idea of the subject in this act, and how the act is to be interpreted in potentially those different contexts. And it's just an open question to thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, the silence, the article that I think you're referring to is the penultimate chapter of this book.
Okay, good.
And it is, I mean, I've reworked it somewhat, but that does kind of culminate in the more, because there's an arc in the book that I didn't really talk about, which begins with a more sort of stark contrast between the Western subject and acts of what I call desubjectivation. And then I sort of try to move away from the most radical forms of disembodiment toward these more nebulous forms of self-injury and bodily agency that are not simply repudiation of the modern subject, but resubjectify in different ways, a kind of counter-subjectify in different ways. I mean, I think the initial ones, like the enslaved suicides, also contain an implicit counter-subjectivity, but there's no space or opportunity to bring that out as a possibility. You're just, enacting self-destruction. Whereas with the ones that are more protracted and based on self-injury or like these other forms of bodily agency, there's more space for the alternative, the counter-subjectivity to come to the fore, along with the desubjectivation that's taking place. So in that sense, it kind of like is a bookend chapter in a way. And it's precisely because it is a kind of, an alternative form of being human that I see there at play. Now, I have not entertained as much as I should, the cultural specificity of each of these acts. I try to bring out in the cases that I discuss. For example, when I'm talking about Bobby Sands, I have a much more extended discussion of what fasting practices meant in the Irish tradition. And kind of like a cultural prehistory of that and what it meant in a kind of a militancy context. Or when I'm talking about Gandhi, there's that. And there are allusions to the various cultural forms in which self-destruction or self-injury has been associated with traditions. But I don't really go into it as deeply as I should, or I don't raise it also to the level of a theoretical problem of like how does cultural specificity modify the perception of it. Because I mean, partly it's an omission, and partly it's, a kind of a decision that I had to make in trying to bring out a little bit the commonality across a wide spectrum, because it's really, I mean, and this goes to some of the points that Anna made and Key also made. The kinds of actors that resort to these forms of action, so diverse, culturally diverse, economically diverse. There are tendencies that are identifiable. I mean, it's not a coincidence, for example, that the rates of self-destruction among the First Peoples and the indigenous is sometimes tenfold the average population in the societies in which they're part. That cannot be a coincidence. But at the same time, there's that, and then there's the Japanese guy. So like they are in a sense along a spectrum. So I kind of made the decision to try to bracket out as much as possible the differentiation of context in order to distill more or less the commonalities. But of course, this comes at a kind of cost of not being able to communicate the complexities of each situation as well. And I'm painfully aware of that. But
I look forward to reading it. Sounds really wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Banu, and everyone else. Great talk. I'll echo Robert's comments that when I read the book, I think that our last conversation, you've been kind of putting touches on groups and described it in not deflationary, considerably more humble kind of like terms. I was really just struck by its ambition and scope. And also by, this is the way you started off your talk today, by the reoccurrence of certain problems that had much more, let's say, ethnographic specificity in your earlier work, and to see all of those kinds of like questions and thematics opened up in their full kind of like philosophical breadth, which is also kind of how you describe the term itself, which I thought was interesting. So like in that, at that register, I'm kind of interested in not just what you've said today, but actually all of the different sort of responses that I've been hearing. And I'm curious about your alternative metaphilosophical discourse, in the sense that it's much easier for me to understand your project insofar as it's positioned relative to the two metaphilosophical discourses that you describe, universalist or progressive version of history, philosophy of history, and the rational, self-transparent, instrumentalist subject, modern subject. And you said that you didn't thematize space in response to Keel, but actually, like, to me, what really strikes me about the book is how spatial most of your principal metaphors are. Perhaps not in the sense that you were pushing at, which I think would probably be something more like spatio-temporal, but in the sense that they are non-temporal construals of space. So the body itself, even in kind of like a Plessiner's conception that you've explored a little bit, is something that we can see as not falling into a notion of time as sequentiality, cause effect, things like this, right? And the notion of excess, of reservoir, of all these things, even just the different metaphors for the struggling, oppressed, or things like this, which seem to emphasize a kind of like subterranean, a kind of like permanent and continuous aspect of experience. So I guess like part of my question is that when we talk about these things, it's like reservoir. it seems like part of the question is then like how they can be taken up. I guess what I'm wondering is like, what is an adequate temporality of political agency for your project, if that makes sense? That's not, it doesn't seem enough to me, I guess, to just say we can't have these two, or these two versions of the same thing. And I guess, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense of the question, but it seems to be like a lot of the questions of teleology, of modernity versus pre-modernity, and all of these other kinds of questions sort of maybe come down to or are interrelated.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all of you. You've been so generous with your praise. I'm sure I don't deserve it. I don't look. I mean, I think what is clear to me at the end of writing the book is different than what was clear to me when I started it. And in a sense, every book is a journey of self-transformation. But for me, this was definitely more pronounced in the case of this book than anything else I've written, because it made me question a lot of my strongly held beliefs, some of them from my training, some of them from my experience. And so the kind of, self-reflexivity that comes at the end about what was motivating this way of posing the problem is, in a sense, the result of the process of posing it. And so had I had that insight into myself at the beginning, I think I might have written a different book. To go back to something that Key brought up, which comes at the end of the book about the political ontology that I find myself to be thinking in, was not something that I had at the front of my mind when I started out the book. And I assume maybe it's kind of like what you had in mind, but maybe I'm misunderstanding where the question was going. But then, when you take a step back, I'm the first one to generate the critique of what I say and to kind of try to think through that. Not necessarily in order to develop a preemptive response, but to see what shortcomings are stitched into every possible position in an argument. And I see the shortcomings of where I've arrived at. But at the same time, as I was saying, I also kind of think that, it's a thought experiment in a certain way. So I don't know if I got the gist of your question. I may have responded with kind of what's on my mind, but do correct me if I went in a different direction.
Well, I guess I'm just like wondering about this. So if it's a reservoir, if there is this archive of agency, if there is, and again, you actually do reach for like temporal metaphors as well, lineage, alternative narratives, and things like this. I'm kind of wondering, okay, so that's something that you're saying can be taken up, practiced, it can be given political meaning that doesn't need the sanction of being fit into a progressive narrative or a linear temporal structure or something like that. But nevertheless, it seems like to just say that it's there in this de-ordered way or something like that, like it seems your claim for political agency actually has something to do with tempora that happens in time. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's kind of what I wonder is like, what gives it that stamp of saying
this is a form of political agency, aside from the fact that it pushes back or resists the progressive linear temporality or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to. I don't know. I have to think about that.
I have to think about my question.
I have to think about that. You know, it's a profound question, and I don't have a ready-made answer for it because I think, it is my political act is to create both a temporal and a spatial interweaving of these acts that have no connections with one another. Some of them mutually cite one another, but that's a very small proportion, really speaking, very small number of these acts. And I'm thinking here of how, for example, the Irish political prisoners cite the Indian revolutionaries, how Nazism cites the Indian revolutionaries, the Russian revolutionaries. There is a revolutionary tradition that kind of feeds into this, but it's only a minor part. But beyond the mutual citations, there's also like a lot of disconnected and disparate acts. And I am, in a sense, like as an author, that's my political intervention to make the threads visible, or to construct, to stitch them together, if you want, where there are no threads, necessary threads. So that I see, I don't necessarily suggest, okay, now building on this, we can organize, or something more instrumentally oriented. That's not what I have in mind. Although what I am saying, and perhaps that's where you're moving toward, or asking me to move toward, is that this corporeal basis is something that we need to attend to as the precondition of something more. And in that sense, I think it does the groundwork for something else. But that is not, I'm not going to be the one doing that. That's for sure. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. I also have a question, but I will ask you my question tonight. There is already 3, and thank you it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for